Back to WCHS Presents WRPS Summer School. Today is our second last hangout with new content. So tomorrow will be our last hangout with new content, and tomorrow we'll look at the Cold War, and that's lesson number 30. Today we have lesson 28, challenges with liberalism, and we were also asked to specifically look at the analysis of the source for the essay that's due this week. So we're going to begin with analyzing that source for the essay that's due this week. And we are then going to go to the new content from lesson 28. So I'm going to just put in the chat feature a link to the essay that you guys have been working on. I know you already have been there because I've seen some of you there this morning, but I'm just putting the link there so that it's easy for you to access it. So unless there's some questions, we're going to dive into the analysis of the source of the essay due Wednesday. So to begin with, do we have any questions before we get to the essay? I'm horrible at pausing because I just want to jump and keep going. We'll wait.
Any questions?
I don't see any questions popping up, so we are going to go to the intro and to the analysis of the essay. Now, the reason behind the essay, so why are we writing this essay? At this point, we have already explored economic essays, and we've already explored a political essay on the midterm and also a take-home political. But before we get to the diploma exam, I need to make sure that you understand that there is one other type of essay that's out there. And that's why we're looking at this essay. It's an essay that has a political portion to it, so there's nuances of politics, but there's also this idea of foreign policy. And in January 2011, the province was surprised when they faced this essay format, and they really underachieved. So we want to make sure that we understand that there is a third option in August, that there is a potential of an essay that could be looking at foreign policy. So that's why we have this essay. It's also a take-home because you already have an exam this week. Enjoy your day. We already have an exam this week. And on Wednesday, we have the multiple choice and we have the A1. We were going to add the A2, this essay, on Wednesday, just as a part of that final exam. But honestly, that would have been a lot of work on Wednesday for you. So rather than having this essay as a part of the final exam, I made it into a take-home essay. And I also made it into a take-home because it's a bit of a challenging essay because it's looking at different case studies. So the first thing we're going to do is unpack this essay, talk about the nuances. And again, while we unpack the essay, we're going to be using the same skills, the same tools that we've used in an A1. So as you unpack the language of an essay in A2, you're using the same skills, the same tools, the same steps that you'd use with a language source in A1. So the source itself on that link there says, we must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. So that's how the source begins, right? We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. So we can already infer. There's something we can infer here. Based upon that first sentence, we can infer something. And we can infer that the speaker is in a place, and later we'll see it's America because America is announced in the next sentence, but this speaker is in a place where there's a conflict between the idea of dissent and disloyalty, that there's this policy that's trying to limit dissent. So when I read that first sentence, we must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. I have too many windows open. I'm going to close a few. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. Then the key term here is confuse, right? There's a tone to the word confuse. So confusion's not a state that we want to be in. And this individual is inferring that America is in a state of confusion. So the word confusion is being indirectly applied to America. And no one wants to be confused. Confused is humbling, it's humiliating, right? So something about America is flawed. When you're confused, you're flawed, right? You're not thinking clearly, you're not rational, you're not reasonable. Being rational and reasonable are some of those conditions that Locke pointed out that must be evident for us to exist in a liberal democracy. And he's saying, you know what, there's something confused here. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. So we unpack the word confusion, you know, that it's the word confusion is being applied to America and the American system. And then we have to say, when would dissent be confused with disloyalty in America's history? So we could somehow hypothesize the context. Now, I know that being that it's a take-home, you can simply Google it and you can figure out that it's Edward R. Murrow and you can get the history behind it. But let's pretend for a moment that instead of being able to Google it and find out it's from 1954, we're looking at it and saying, okay, when might it be from? We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty is sentiment that could be in America today. That in America today, this is a problem that many people are exposing in America today. That there are people protesting in the streets of the United States, whether it be hashtag Black Lives Matter, or whether it be people protesting that, you know, he's not my president, or the Me Too movement. There's a lot of protest within America. People protesting, and a lot of that is really focused. A lot of that energy is focused on Donald Trump, that they don't feel that he is a worthy president. So some Republicans, some people that want to protect Trump, they would say, wow, you guys are being disloyal. You're being disloyal to the president, that you cannot speak out against the president's policies. Whether that be building a wall or whether that be closing airports, it's not the right thing to question your president. So one possible context could be present day America. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. This would be a voice saying, the idea that there's dissent in the streets, that's a healthy democracy. A sign of a healthy democracy is that there's multiplicity of opinion, that there's discussion, that there's debate, right? And if we are encouraged to silence the opposition, that won't be a healthy democracy. So one possible context is America today. Another possible context would be America of 2003. So in 2003, the United States led an armed intervention in Iraq. And the purpose of that was a regime change to topple the Saddam Hussein government and to impose liberalism. So in 2003, there were some within America, including the Dixie Chicks, who famously said, he's not our president. And because they said that, they were labeled Saddam's angels and they were labeled as traitors. So when in 2003, the Dixie Chicks challenged President George W. Bush's decision to go to war in Iraq to commit a regime change to impose liberalism, they were labeled as disloyal. And the voice behind the source would say, that's not disloyalty, that's dissent. Dissent is not disloyalty. Dissent is questioning government policy, including foreign policy like going to war. Dissent does not mean that you don't believe in America or believe in the founding principles of America. It doesn't mean that you would be a fifth column and help others invade America. That's not what dissent is. Dissent is just questioning policy, and questioning policy is a fundamental part of a democracy. But as we know, this isn't inspired by 2003 or 2020. This is inspired by 1954 Edward R. Murrow. So the context here is McCarthyism. The context is the witch hunt against communists. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. So what had happened, if you go to the link that I provided in this document, what had happened was that people were beginning to be uncomfortable with the illiberal actions of the executive branch and the illiberal actions of McCarthy and HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And they began to question the purpose and the scope of HUAC's activities, these witch hunts, the blacklisting of people in Hollywood. And when they began to question McCarthy, they were labeled as traitors. They were labeled as being disloyal. So the first sentence, we must not confuse dissent with disloyalty, announces possible context. The context here is 1954 McCarthyism. But it also shows that, unfortunately, the context still applied in 2003 in Iraq, or the invasion of Iraq, and also in 2020 today. That it establishes a reoccurring context, a struggle within a liberal democracy. Because within a liberal democracy, we're encouraged to question the state. But because we're encouraged to question the state, some forces, some conservative forces may see it as being disloyal. So the first thing we could do is establish context. Second thing we could say is, what is the problem in society that this person's trying to expose? And the problem is the idea that people are being mislabeled disloyal. That's the problem that they're seeing, is that people are being mislabeled as disloyal. The problem is censorship. The problem is the forces of the state trying to create obedient citizens rather than active citizens. That's the problem. Now, the problem is magnified in that next sentence. When the loyal opposition dies, I think the soul of America dies with it. So that's the significance of the source. So we know the problem is that some are being mislabeled as disloyal because they're voices of dissent against government policy. The significance of it is the suggestion that if we're not allowed to question the state, the soul of America dies. So then we could discuss, why is it significant that it talks about the soul? Well, the soul is something that is supposed to be, eternal, something that lives beyond the limitations of these physical bodies. The soul of America is meant to be eternal, something that is beyond the lifespan of any individual citizen. That the soul is something that needs to be cherished, and we shouldn't betray the cornerstone of our soul. So what is the soul of America then? When the loyal opposition dies, I think the soul of America dies with it. We can infer that the source is suggesting that the soul of America is that citizens get to hold their government accountable. I mean, that's the reason why they had a revolution in the first place, because the government had to be held accountable. The American Revolution was a revolution against the monarchy, and against the constitutional monarchy, yes, but still against the monarchy in England that didn't want to be accountable to the American people. So the American people fought a revolution, and one of the slogans was, no taxation without representation. So one of the founding principles in America is this idea of accountability, that we have the right to hold the government accountable, that the legitimacy of government comes from the will of the people. But what is happening is the will of the people is being silenced because it's being labeled disloyal, that the people are not allowed to will opposition to the government policy. So even the term loyal opposition, I love the word loyal, that when the loyal opposition dies, there's a juxtaposition there, right? Of the idea that to be opposed to the government might actually be showing loyalty. And there's a nice contrast with the word disloyalty in the previous sentence. So it's talking about the obligation, the responsibility of citizens to living under injustice, that a just man must question the state. And that goes back to Henry David Thoreau and the idea that a just man living under an unjust ruler should be in jail. The idea that you have an obligation as a citizen to hold your government accountable. So there's a nice play on language there between disloyalty and loyalty. So when the loyal opposition dies, so they're stating right there that it's loyalty. To not oppose your government would be to be disloyal. But what you're being loyal to is not to Donald Trump. You're not being loyal to him. You're not being loyal to George W. Bush. You're not being loyal to Joseph McCarthy, the senator. You're being loyal to the soul of America. That's where your loyalty needs to be. Your loyalty needs to be with the foundation of America. And that's kind of like Edmund Burke when he says that we are a link in a great chain of being. This idea that our loyalty is beyond just like the things that are contemporary. Our loyalty has to be to those big rocks that created the soul of our country. So lots of great language there. We cannot, and this is again expressing the significance, we cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. So this is 1954, a time when the United States is engaged in a Cold War, stopping the spread of non-liberalism, trying to defend freedom throughout the world, trying to contain communism, stop the dominoes from falling. But it's suggesting there's a disconnect between U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic policy. There's a disconnect from the idea that we're going to go abroad to defend freedom, but at home, we're going to expect obedience from our citizens. Abroad, we're going to try to encourage governments that allow transparency and the will of the people to be their foundation, but at home, we're going to silence opposition. So the source is showing the disconnect between foreign and domestic policy, and also showing the hypocrisy, right? That America of 1954 was being very hypocritical in the sense that they're suggesting that abroad countries should be very open and transparent and liberal, but at home, you shouldn't question the state. You should not question the state. This is similar to the cartoon from the multiple choice exam, the cartoon that showed a classroom and a teacher saying, you must watch your parents, and the year was 1951. So the context is still the same. So again, problem. What is the problem? The problem is there's a misidentification of people being disloyal in America. The problem is that there's a conflict surrounding the role of a citizen. That's the problem. And the problem is that some want citizens to be obedient, whereas others see that the need of citizens must be to hold their government accountable. So key words, confusion. Why do they use the word confuse? You know, what kind of context, emotional response do we get to the word confusion? Also dissent. We want to unpack, what does dissent look like? When is dissent healthy and when is it too much? So in your essay, I want you to talk about dissent. I should be able to do Control F and see the word dissent 9, 10 times. And I want you to connect with dissent when it's loyal to be a voice of dissent. But I also want you to show, when is it reasonable to limit dissent? Under what circumstances do we silence people, whether it be temporarily or permanently? When should things be censored? Under what conditions would it be reasonable? Even though this isn't Canada, we can still use the language of the Charter, the reasonable limits, to unpack it. This is America, and the right to dissent is a part of the First Amendment. So we want to link it to that. We're going to talk about the struggle between Hobbes and Locke here, but there's also room to introduce Sorel and Gentile and Schopenhauer, the idea that should we submit our will to others? Should my will be subject to the will of the government? And if the government's will seems to be different than mine, should I simply silence my will? Is it only through service or obedience to the state that I can actually have a fulfilled life? So even though none of that's in the source directly, we can connect it to the debate surrounding the source. You know, what is the role of citizens? What is the role of government is a part of the source. But a part of the source too is, what should America be doing in its foreign policy? We cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. Should America be imposing liberalism? Is a part of your essay to answer as well. So lots of connections to liberalism here. So it's not just a political essay about the role of citizens. It's a political essay about the role of citizens, the role of government, plus an essay where you're meant to talk about foreign policy. So should America in 1945 rebuild Japan in America's image? Should America during the Cold War, should they be trying to create puppet states, or should they try to create proxies that are in America's image in Latin America, in Nicaragua, and Honduras, and Chile? Should America in the 1960s try to change Vietnam? Should America in 2003 change Iraq? Should America today be changing Afghanistan? You know, that's a part of this question. You know, when is it acceptable to impose our values on others? And while we're imposing our values, why is it important to look back at our own country and say, are we actually living the values we're forcing upon others? Or is there a disconnect here? Are we saying, you know, freedom for Iraq, you know, American democracy is great, but back in America, we're silencing people. So why would they want to emulate us if we're not worthy of emulation? So any questions about the intro? Any questions about the language of the intro? So the case studies I'd like to see, obviously, it's important to go back to Edward R. Murrow and talk about the actual context. And that's why I provided that link there. So that's definitely important to unpacking it. But in terms of your body, we must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. When the loyal opposition dies, I think the soul of America dies with it. You must continue your discussion about McCarthyism. We cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. I think you need to talk about the conflict within the Cold War, about, you know, trying to stop the spread of non-liberalism and the disconnect with American policy back home. And the American policy back home might be more than just McCarthyism. It might be the ideas of segregation. You know, the idea that in America, we didn't have equality. We still had racism. And yet abroad, they're trying to, you know, dismantle inequality. So that's an interesting nuance here as well. But I think that we need some contemporary stuff. You need to have that post 9/11 US response to the Islamic world and the disrupting of the regimes there in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya and Syria, and seeing to what extent has their foreign policy created good or has it created bad. Any questions about the intro? There's definitely thesis statements possible here, you know, although this, but this and that, you know, although it's important to allow dissent, but there are times, and explore those times, when we need to have unity, right? But there still must be room for, you know, watchdog journalism. We still need that. We don't want to have the case like in 2003 when they go to war in Iraq, where the would-be watchdogs of democracy say, you know, when my nation's at war, I'm at war, and they simply become embedded with the troops so that the media becomes a loudspeaker for the Bush administration's policy. That there still needs to be, maybe in crisis even more so, opportunity to question the state. So, any further questions about this essay? So it is due Wednesday night at like midnight, so that I can mark them on Thursday morning, because all my marks are due by noon on Thursday. So if you hand this in after noon on Thursday, I can't mark it. I have to send my marks in to Alberta Ed. So it is due by the latest Wednesday night at midnight. It is really the first chapter of the final exam. And again, I didn't want to give you 3 things to do on Wednesday as closed exams, right? So I gave you some time before Wednesday to get ready for this. If there's no other questions, I'm just going to start talking about the lesson 28 then. Before I do so, marks are updated in Power School, and marks are bubbling up. So lots of people have seen marks go up in the last week. Please keep in mind that the final exam on Wednesday is an opportunity to replace a low midterm score. So it's going to be recorded as a final exam regardless, but it could end up taking up 2 spots on the exams if you end up outperforming one of your midterms. So if you have a low midterm score, we can definitely see some improvement come Wednesday. And on Wednesday, you have an A1 and you have a set of multiple choice. There's 55 multiple choice. So there's some that go all the way back to the first lesson of the year, but there's going to be a lot on this week's stuff as well. So I'd like to highlight some of what's on this week's stuff today and tomorrow. Can I go into more depth of what I expect from the term project? So before I get started with the new stuff then, the term project due on Thursday is meant to get you ready for the diploma exam. So that's the purpose. The term project due on Thursday is the chart that looks at all of the inquiry questions that have ever been asked on the major administrations of the diploma. And I want you to break it down into the other categories. You know, what are the key terms you must analyze? What's the ideological perspective? What are some arguments you could make? And what's some evidence that you'd use to further the arguments? There is a link to a student's project that has done it in the past. So if you're really lost about what to do, open up that project, look at it, do a save as, and just make it better. So you literally could just take their work and make it better. So the purpose of it is to get you more ready for the essay. And what I'd like you to see is that aside from the essay that we're doing right now, all the other essays that we've seen on the diploma really fit into 1 or 2 categories. And once we prep for those 2 categories, I think you can do awfully well on the diploma. So if you're still a little confused as to what to do for the term project, there is a link to a sample one there. And I would say just open up that link, do a save as, change it so that it's now, you know, your name, and then make it better. Add to the key terms that must be analyzed. Are there any key terms that are missed there? Add to possible arguments that they could make. Add to the evidence that you could use and the key quotes and vocabulary. But definitely see the student sample there as a starting point if you are lost on it. You could also send me a rough draft. I've had a couple of students send me their process so far, and they've said, hey, am I on the right track here? So you're not meant to, you don't have to do a video with it. You don't have to do a podcast. It's just that some people in the past have done that. I would say that being that this is summer school and, although we have more time, it's more condensed. I would suggest that what you need to do for the term project is fill in the chart. And if you're lost, start by making a copy of the chart that I provided as a sample and then improve it. Go through it and make it better. Make it yours. So are you meant to do a rule of man essay as well? No. You can, Shiv. By all means, write more essays, but you don't have to. All right, so let's jump into some new stuff. I'm going to be looking at a few topics here today. One thing should we do two separate arguments, one against and one for, or should we just have one response? All right, so this will be the last question about the term project, because we do have content to get through today. You can always ask term project questions by email too, but we definitely have to get through the content because you're going to get tested on it in a day and a half from now. Should we do two separate arguments? You should prepare two separate arguments, yes. Now, you might be saying, but I know that I'd take this statement in the essay. In order to understand the division of society, I think it's important for you to understand more than one argument. And depending upon the language of the source, one argument might be more logical than the other. So I think it's a richer experience to go through and prepare a second argument. But for each argument you prepare, for each thesis statement that you would create, I want you to come up with supporting arguments. That the weakness of most people's writing is that they have a thesis statement and then very little argumentation after. So I do think that the more work you can do with argumentation, the stronger that part of people's essays will be. All right, so 9/11. So 9/11 is obviously a terrorist attack on the United States that doesn't happen in isolation. The United States had been attacked previously by Islamic fundamentalist forces, including the World Trade Centers in 1993. But there's a couple of possible narratives to the 9/11 attack. One narrative is that the attack was an attack by Islamic fundamentalism against America. And in this narrative, America is seen to be fairly innocent, that America was a victim of an aggressive Islamic fundamentalist movement to slow the spread of freedom. And this would be the narrative that the United States is trying to sell to the world, the idea that America was innocent, and therefore its response was justified. But there's another possible narrative about the U.S. being attacked. And the other possible narrative was the United States had caused the attack through its own foreign policy by exporting American values, by Americanizing the planet, right? Homogenization and Americanization, words from Social 10, by attempting Americanization of the planet, by attempting to homogenize very conservative spheres elsewhere, like the Middle East, by attempting to impose American values, it caused a blowback on America. So blowback is the unintended consequences of your actions. So maybe the United States didn't intend to be attacked by terrorists, but because of their foreign policy, it caused a blowback. And their foreign policy was imposing and exporting American values, values of individualism. Individualism that don't always coincide with the values people hold elsewhere. Some people do value authoritarianism. They do value, instead of progress, they value conservatism. They may value conservatism because they don't want to sway from the cornerstone of their faith and their culture. And therefore, to protect their faith and their culture, they need to try to slow or stop the spread of American values, and they need to send a message to America to get out of their sphere of influence. And that's what the other narrative behind 9/11 is. So one narrative is the United States is just another victim of terrorism, that Islamic fundamentalism is using force and terror, intimidation to try to abuse human rights elsewhere and to stop us from helping those who are imprisoned elsewhere. But a second narrative would be that America isn't completely innocent, that America has been guilty of imposing and exporting its values. So along that narrative, we have to look at, to what extent has the United States, through their foreign policy, used it as an instrument to promote liberalism. So one example would be Japan 1945. Japan 1945, at the end of a bayonet, was created into an American clone. So at the end of the war, America occupies Japan, rebuilds Japan in America's image. Now, the United States and Japan today have a great relationship. Japan is America's greatest ally in the Asia-Pacific theater. But it wasn't a willing alliance in the beginning. It was an alliance that was forced upon the Japanese people. And the idea of forcing freedom upon others is a paradox that is somewhat captured in that essay this week. Should we promote liberalism at the end of a bayonet? So we also see it in Vietnam in the 1960s. And in Vietnam in the 1960s, we try to slow or stop or contain the spread of communism. This led to both an ideological conflict in Vietnam, but also an ideological conflict at home. And the ideological conflict at home in the 1960s also fits into the essay. This idea that in the 1960s in America, there was a conflict in the streets of America, and the conflict was between those who would not support the war and those who did support the war. And therefore, just like we have today, where the streets are being used as a means to express the will to the government, in America in the 1960s, 1968 was a key year in America, 1970 again, there will be very loud protests, both in opposition to, but also at times supporting, which seems ironic or weird, supporting the US policy of war in Vietnam. So this is an example of an A1 source just waiting to be tested, right? The idea that you could have a protest that's actually celebrating US foreign policy. And the purpose behind the protest is a counter-protest against others who may be protesting it. So in the 1960s and early 70s in America, we saw this kind of protest, both protests in favor and protests against the war in Vietnam. So, for example, in 1970, there was going to be some key elections for Congress, and it was one of those years where they were trying to decide, the soul of America. Again, to go back to the language of the essay, does the soul of America fall with the very vocal and active liberals who are marching in the streets against the policies of President Nixon? Or is there a soul of America that fell with the quote unquote silent majority? So in April of 1970, on the lawns outside the White House, there was a protest by the silent majority saying that they support the war in Vietnam, that in God we trust, in the government we trust, that we are loyal. So within that idea of, the silent majority being loyal to the state and supporting the war in Vietnam shows some of that conflict in the streets of America because of U.S. foreign policy. But some would say that the conflict itself is healthy, that there needs to be somebody questioning the state policy. If everyone just was obedient and following policy, it'd be easy to be led to a dystopian reality when you just unconditionally accept the policies of Big Brother. So we see the United States imposing liberalism in Iraq in 2003, leading up to the Iraqi election in 2005. So what is a manifestation of the United States imposing liberalism? Well, in Iraq in 2005, there was a free election, but many people, even in America in 2005, were saying, well, are we worthy of emulation? You know, is the US system so healthy that we should be imposing it upon others? So one could look at their own policy, their own system, and say, are there things about our system that are so flawed we wouldn't want others to emulate? And one of the problems in the United States of 2005 and still today in 2020 is apathy. So they created a regime change in Iraq starting in 2003. They're going to have a free election as a manifestation of that regime change in 2005, an election where people risked their lives to vote. You know, women were having their fingers cut off if they had that purple dye on them, but they were excited that they finally had the right to vote. But is the US system worthy of emulation, or is it flawed by things like apathy and corruption? So one of the nuances of this conflict is, in order to be worthy of emulation, the United States needs to deal with flaws within their system at home. That instead of imposing liberalism, people may willingly adopt it if the US system was worthy of emulation. So we need to get rid of corruption. We need to get rid of the power of the 1% to dictate to the 99% due to their undue influence of government policy. We need watchdog journalism. We need journalists that, instead of being embedded with government policy, are questioning government policy. We need people to anticipate the blowback of our foreign policy and not be surprised when we're attacked on 9/11. So many would argue that 9/11, September the 11th, 2001, which led to the USA Patriot Act, will change the relationship between government and governed in America. Now, the idea here is, you know, was the threat real? Or was the threat imagined? Was the threat exaggerated? So in 1933, there was a threat to the Weimar Republic. And we know, in hindsight, that Adolf Hitler exaggerated the threat so that he could justify his enabling act. He could justify the usurpation of freedom. Following the attack of 9/11 in America, the question could be asked, you know, was there a real threat? Was there real and present danger to America, or did the Bush administration exaggerate the threat so that they could change the relationship between government and governed? And many voices of opposition, whether they're loyal or not, would suggest that the USA Patriot Act was unconstitutional and unnecessary because the threat was not as severe as the alarmists in government led people to believe. That they used it as an opportunity to take freedom from the people. Now, you could argue that, you know, this may be incorrect, because if that was the case, why did we end up getting a President Barack Obama? You know, we still had free elections in America. And the Republican Party of Bush ended up losing the 2008 election. Not Bush himself, because he ran his 2 terms in office, but in 2008, Obama wins the election. And because he wins the election in 2008, we do have a regime change of sorts in America. And had 9/11 been this great moment in American history where democracy was ripped from the people, I don't think there would have been a change in party, unless the 2 parties are really the same agenda. Other than that, the only other idea that I have coming out of the tests on Wednesday, big picture, is the idea is, does America have an obligation to spread liberalism or to defend liberalism? America before World War I, America before World War II, both times they're practicing isolationism. But following the fall of the British Empire, America took up the torch of liberty, and that they became the torchbearer of democracy. and it became their responsibility to defend democracy. And the question could be asked, is there an obligation for the US government and US citizens living in America to come to the aid of people outside of America that have been condemned by birth to live in a non-liberal state, condemned by birth to live in a state that because they're born female, they're born unequal, or condemned by birth because they're born by a different ethnicity, they're born unequal. Again, many people would say that if America wants to achieve that role of coming to the liberty of those marginalized outside of America, well, they have to do that within America first. You can't have a system that marginalizes people in America and use force to try to say, you know what, we're going to come and save people that are being marginalized in Iraq. So the Iraqi government are marginalizing religious minorities and marginalizing women. Many people would say that there's a disconnect there because the US government still marginalizes women. So those are some big picture things before we get into the lesson itself. Any questions about the big picture things before we get into the lesson itself? So the big picture things just come from some notes that I took when I looked at the A1 that you get on Wednesday. The A1 on Wednesday will be about this topic. It will be about foreign policy, and its connection to liberalism won't be political or economic. It'll be, should America impose liberalism? That's the conversation through the A1 on Wednesday. You've already had an economic A1. You've already had a political A1. You've had more than one of each. Now you need to see that other option in an A1. So you will see this on Wednesday on the set of sources. The set of sources will be looking at U.S. foreign policy and looking at, to what extent is it justified to impose liberalism abroad? That's one of those overarching themes that the three will share. Under what circumstances does it become acceptable to impose your values upon others? And on your sources on Wednesday, you'll have a source that is looking at 9/11, and it's going to be looking at 9/11, and it's going to be suggesting that 9/11 wasn't an isolated incident, but 9/11 is that blowback because of U.S. foreign policy, that the United States is guilty of imperialism, but not imperialism in the historical sense of invading Africa and planting your flag and creating a colony, but an ideological imperialism, a cultural imperialism, an imperialism where you target the hearts and minds of others through capitalism, through consumerism, through American values. So that's going to be one of the sources. Another source is going to be looking at that silent majority, that idea that in 1970 there was within America an ideological conflict between those who supported the war in Vietnam and those who didn't. So I want you to understand that idea of protest in America, protesting the war in Vietnam, and protesting in favor of the war. So look up silent majority 1970 and learn more about them. I'm not giving away too much about the diploma because they've already used that photo on the diploma, on a past diploma. And then there'll be a cartoon looking at the Bush administration and the imposing of liberalism and we can infer that it's places like Afghanistan and Iraq, but there won't be a specific location given. And the purpose of the cartoon is to look at, what is it that the U.S. is imposing? Is it I'm imposing the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, freedom of association? Is it the Bill of Rights that we're packaging and saying, here, you need to adopt this? Or are we imposing some more trivial parts of American culture? Like, what is it that we want people to adopt? What if America was like a disease or a cure? What actually is that infection look like? What are we using to infect others? So those will be the sources that you see on the A1. And the other stuff I mentioned will help you with some of the multiple choice. Can we still refer to it as imperialism, or should we say modern or new imperialism? I would say use the term like new or neo-imperialism, and I'll just type that in. You might use neo-imperialism. You might refer to it as cultural imperialism. Because what we're trying to do is control people through culture, right? You might refer to it as Americanization. This idea of trying to create homogenization, and that should be a capital A. The idea of trying to create homogenization. What they're really doing is imposing liberalism by trying to win the hearts and minds, right? So it's a very similar activity as what was done domestically in Canada with our Indigenous people. The idea that we're trying to distract the Indigenous people so that they didn't understand that their culture was being lost, or we wanted to replace their culture with ours. So we tried to distract them with blankets and pots and pans and things like that. So it's looking at it as a new trade, a new exchange, and with the exchange comes cultural contamination, and therefore it's more of a cultural economic imperialism than just a military imperialism. All right, any other questions about the A1 or the essay before we jump into lesson 28 specifically? So the lesson 28 has a ton of important topics that are highlighted in pink for you. It begins with some key notes about imposing liberalism. So if you still don't know what imposing liberalism is, if you impose something, there's no choice of the other person in the exchange. You're forcing it upon them. You're imposing it. If you impose your will, then people, they don't want to accept your will, but they're forced to accept it. And people who value freedom should be upset by something being imposed. But the irony here is we're imposing freedom. You're imposing liberalism, and liberalism is usually identified as freedom. So we're going to use our bayonets, we're going to use our tanks and military to change your regime from non-liberal to liberal. We're imposing liberalism. And to be honest, in places it has been celebrated. There are some places that have benefited after being transformed into America's image. It would be a logical case study to say that Japan has benefited from having imposed liberalism imposed upon it. But as the notes on the first page of that lesson 28 show, there's been casualties elsewhere. That Naomi Klein, in her 2007 book, The Shock Doctrine, she's critical of neoconservative foreign policies of imposing liberalism in Latin America because at least 100 to 150,000 people have been murdered by the governments that America has put into place. So in places like Chile in 1973, the United States created a regime change. They toppled the government that was chosen by the people, but the government wasn't a liberal democracy. The government didn't value capitalism. They valued communism. And America didn't want collectivism and communism in their backyard. So they used the CIA and the military to do a regime change in Chile. And they put in a puppet regime, somebody that would be more loyal to Washington, D.C. Well, as a result of that, the government that they put into place ends up killing many people opposed to U.S. values in Chile. So in Latin America, there's been at least 150,000 people killed, murdered by governments loyal to Washington. There seems to be, again, a disconnect here about what is freedom, what is liberalism. So there's some notes there about that. There's also notes about Iraq and the Bush administration. And the idea is that the recurring theme that Naomi Klein is trying to argue is that it's not really about democracy. When the United States uses its military to enforce their will upon other countries like Iraq, democracy may be part of the way that they package it. They're selling it like it's a democracy. It's like, hey, we're here to give you democracy, democracy. But it's not for democracy. It's not for democracy. It's for capitalism. So Naomi Klein would be an example of someone that is a voice of dissent, that's suggesting that she cannot follow the then Bush administration's war in Iraq because she's arguing that it's not really about democracy. It's really about capitalism. That she would argue that the U.S. military is being used as gangsters for capitalism. And what they've been doing is opening up markets for U.S. interests, markets in places like Iraq. So did the United States go to war in Iraq because of economic opportunities there? Naomi Klein would say yes. And there's other notes here too by Paul Krugman. And Paul Krugman is suggesting that America was more democratic in the Keynesian New Deal era than it is under Reagan and his successors. Because under Reagan and their successors, when they tax the rich less, what we see is an implosion of the middle class, and we see the rise of the 1%, and now they have the economic power to wield undue political influence. So Krugman would say that the biggest threat to democracy is capitalism. So it's this idea that can liberalism politically coexist with liberalism economically? It's a recurring theme of the course. And we've got some neocons like a Friedman or Hayek or Ayn Rand that would say it can only coexist. That if you don't have both, you don't have true liberalism. But then there's others like Paul Krugman and Naomi Klein who would say that one is a threat to the other. Capitalism is a threat to democracy because with capitalism we'll create disparity, and those with economic wealth will be able to take political power from the masses because their economic wealth pool will afford them opportunities that you and I don't get. So then we have some imposing liberalism notes here. So you can review about what did imposing liberalism look like in Japan. There's some notes about Iraq. There's also notes going back to grade 10, and it reminds you about Bretton Woods and the IMF, all that stuff from chapter 9 of the textbook. And it connects to the case study that we looked at in grade 10 about Bolivia and Bechtel and Cochabamba and the privatization of water, which wasn't in the interest of the Bolivian people, but was in the interest of Bechtel, the American corporation from San Francisco. So we do have some notes there. Any questions about those notes on the first 2 pages of the lesson? Because that's the big picture. Like, more important than understanding everything to follow, we really need to make sure that you get, okay, what is imposing liberalism? Because it could come up on a set of sources. Will on Wednesday, may on the 11th of August. Or sorry, on the 5th of August. So next up, we have chapter 9 of the textbook, Imposing Liberalism Within Canada. There will be some multiple choice questions on your diploma exam from chapter 9, where the context is about the Indian Act of 1876, or about the White Paper of 69, or about residential schools or simulation in general. So I just have some notes there as a reminder that that chapter does exist and that liberalism was imposed in Canada domestically to try to create cultural homogenization. That liberalism was imposed upon Canada's Indigenous peoples. So there's some links there that we need to be familiar with. And then starting on page 4, there's some quotes about Canada's Indigenous peoples from Harold Cardinal and some quotes about FNMI. So I'd ask you just to review those quotes. Those quotes are examples of sources that you could see on an A1 or sources that you could see as a part of a set on multiple choice. Any questions about imposing liberalism, the idea that liberalism was imposed domestically against Canada's Indigenous people? Anybody not see that? So what is liberalism? Instead of living collectively, right? Instead of living collectively as and really identifying as part of a tribe and owning the land collectively, publicly as a tribe, that, you know, this land isn't owned by anyone. It's shared. You know, we are the stewards of the planet for, you know, for the for the gods to work through us to protect the earth and protect the animals. When Europeans came to Canada, we ended up saying, no, we're going to put a fence around this, and this is private land now. So now we have an ideological conflict, and it's manifested in a simple thing like ownership of land. Is the land there owned by the tribe as a collective, really owned by no one, but shared by all? Or can the McBride family put a fence around and say, this is my quarter section, and now I'm going to farm here? So now you can't follow the buffalo into it and hunt the buffalo, or you can't set up a temporary camp over there and live there for part of one season. There's going to be very much changing your culture. Instead of being a nomadic tribe, we're going to try to really force you into a little small reserve of land. And we reserve this land for you to practice your traditional culture, but you won't be able to because the land just won't be able to actually afford you that opportunity. It's not big enough. So we have this idea of imposing liberalism in our history in Canada. Then page 5 looks at promoting or imposing liberalism by force. And there is a sample essay there from January 2011. So as you struggle with the essay that is due Wednesday, you might want to look at that prompt there for some guidance. Then starting on page 6, we look at the war in Afghanistan. And we really don't know what's on the diploma exam, right? But there have been questions about the war in Afghanistan on the diploma. So if you're at a situation where you can't remember anything that happened in Afghanistan and the Canadian involvement, in pink I have a Prezi that's very good at summarizing what Canada did. And in the pink box, I have a government announcement as to what the Canadian forces accomplished there. So in summary, that's what their objectives were. In Iraq, we have the idea of exporting democracy on page 7. And again, we have the idea that maybe the US system is not worthy of emulation, shown in that cartoon. That what defines the US system? Apathy does, because nobody's showing up to vote there. And if apathy defines the US system, then why would others want to emulate it? What is apathy? People not voting, right? People not participating in the political process. Starting on page 8, we have some connections to the UN. The UN doesn't often show up on the diploma, but we want to make sure that you are familiar with those UN challenges from grade 10 and 11, the UN Millennial Development Plans, and just the idea that there is some discussion around, where our loyalty should lie. Should it be with the UN and internationalism, or should we put Canada's needs before the needs of others outside of Canada? That's continued on page 14 with the idea of refugees and the Syrian refugees and what Canadians can do to help. There are many, many, many links here. Most of them quite short. The key ones are in pink. There's some links here about US foreign policy creating terrorism in a nice 3-minute video showing how it can have that unintended consequence of a blowback against the United States. As with our imposing of liberalism, there is, casualties, right? And some of those casualties are unintended casualties. And if there's people that are hurt, then that might harden the hearts of others to fight against America. We also have the connection with Mayor Arar, and Bill C-51 was in the news a couple of years ago, and there's a neat connection between that and the Reichstag fire, and that's why that's in pink as well. There's some other stuff in pink about the U.S. foreign policy. So, for example, in page 17, there's a nice cartoon talking about, why is the United States in Iraq? Are they there to share democracy? Or are they there, like Naomi Klein is suggesting, to maybe Americanize and to homogenize and to be gangsters for capitalism and just get it ready for American corporate interests? On page 19, there's a summary of the Arab Spring. So if the Arab Spring is a case study that you have no connection to, you can't remember what that was about, there's a nice little link there. Now, we don't have time to go through each one of those avenues, Arab Spring, Afghanistan, Iraq, but I'm here now to answer questions that you have assuming that you've already looked at those links. So do you have any questions about some of those contemporary case studies? Do you have questions about the Arab Spring? Do you have questions about Canada in Afghanistan? Do you have questions about the United States in Iraq? Could I please explain more about the case study in Iraq? So I'm going to go back to, I could go back many, many years here. I'm going to go back to 1990. So in order to explain Iraq, Persian Gulf 2, I really want to talk about Iraq, Persian Gulf 1. I'm just going to put a link here. So in 1990, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, decided to use his military, which was recognized as either the fourth or fifth most intimidating military on the planet, the Iraqi Republican Guard, to annex the then independent state of Kuwait. The Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein thought that Kuwait should be Iraq, and that when the foreign powers, when the British and French drew up the boundaries of countries in the Middle East, they created a country that really should not exist in Kuwait. So Saddam Hussein decided, now that he was done fighting against the Iranians in the 1980s, he decided that his next target was to annex Kuwait, and Kuwait could not defend itself. So quickly, the state of Kuwait was annexed and occupied by the Iraqis. This looks a lot like Japan invading Manchuria in 1931. This looks a lot like the Nazi Germans invading Austria in 1989, or in 1938. So the UN has a litmus test. Is the UN going to be another League of Nations and allow bully countries, big countries, to aggressively bully others? The neat thing happening at the UN in 1990 was that the USSR and the United States were friends. So the USSR was beginning to liberalize. So there wasn't a lot of opposition within the Security Council. So the Soviets, the Chinese, the British, the French, and the Americans, they all agreed that, you know what, we can't allow a bully country like Iraq to go and impose their values on someone else. So we are going to come to the aid of Kuwait. So the United States, along with dozens of other countries, they go to the Middle East and they begin to build up troops in Saudi Arabia in August of 1990 to defend the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. So we're going to defend Saudi Arabia because the Saudis asked the Americans to come. So the Saudis, thinking that, well, Kuwait's been annexed, Iraq's probably going to try to annex Saudi Arabia next too. So they asked the United States and then President George H.W. Bush to come and protect them. And the United States does that. And they send hundreds of thousands of troops. This helps inspire Osama bin Laden to hate America. It inspires Osama bin Laden to hate America because now you have US troops in some of the holiest sites for the Islamic world, in Mecca and Medina, guarding these holy sites. And the Americans are seen as infidels. They should not be the ones given the opportunity, the responsibility, opportunity, the privilege to guard Mecca and Medina. It should be Islamic Muslim people. And therefore, some Islamic fundamentalists like Osama bin Laden and eventually Al-Qaeda, they will look at this as a galvanizing time when it shows the United States imposing, right? Even though the United States was invited there by the House of Saud, that's not how OBL is going to see it. OBL is going to say the United States is here to Americanize. You know, the Americans were very cautious. They wanted to make sure that the US troops were on their best behavior in the Middle East. But there's always going to be, when you have hundreds of thousands of Americans waiting to go to war, there's always going to be incidences when an American soldier on their own does something that violates the the customs of the host country, and ends up really solidifying what OBL had thought, that America was there to kind of change the values. So there were some Americans that were guilty of, playing sports with girls, which they shouldn't have been doing in Saudi Arabia. So there was some of that happening on the U.S. bases that ended up causing some controversy. Now, the United States, through Operation Desert Shield, they defend Saudi Arabia. And then January 17th, 1991, Operation Desert Storm, they invade Iraq to liberate Kuwait. But rather than just going straight to Kuwaiti City and liberating Kuwait there, they decide there's only one main highway from Baghdad to Kuwait City. They're going to, they're going to basically trap the Iraqi defense forces on this highway and annihilate them. Use the U.S. Superior Air Force to, for lack of a better term, burn the Iraqis into submission. So when the United States does go to Operation Desert Storm, it's a very quick and vicious response to the annexation of Kuwait. And President George H.W. Bush and Margaret Thatcher of the UK and the UN Security Council, they have a great victory. In 100 hours, they destroy, the fourth or fifth strongest military on the planet. But then the United States has a decision to make. Do we follow up, go up the highway, and go to Baghdad and change the government there? Well, the U.S. forces decide that that's not necessary, that they are going to leave Saddam Hussein's regime in place, that Saddam Hussein has his illegal annexation of Kuwait they've responded to it, but the United States is recognizing that their coalition is somewhat fragile, that within their coalition they have some countries that have some loyalty to Iraq, so they don't want to potentially damage their coalition and harden the hearts of people in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which was on the American side, by committing a regime change in Iraq. So George H.W. Bush follows the policies suggested by Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf to not commit a regime change. And because of that, Saddam Hussein's left in power. So what happens to the rest of the 1990s? Well, Saddam Hussein's not happy that the United States has taken this prize, this Kuwait, from him. So Saddam Hussein tries to get something that can help him stop the U.S. from invading them again. So how can we have something that is so powerful that it will stop the United States from invading us again? Because we want to annex Kuwait. It's got lots of oil. We want to take that. We want to be able to become the power of the Arab world. And how are we going to become the power of the Arab world with Saudi Arabia there as a U.S. ally? What can we do to force our power over Saudi Arabia, over Kuwait? Well, we need weapons of mass destruction. We need nuclear weapons. We already have chemical weapons. We've used them against our own people, the Kurdish people of the north, but now we need nuclear weapons. So in the 1990s, Saddam Hussein plays this very dangerous game where he starts making nuclear weapons, and then the UN says, wait a minute, you're not allowed to have nuclear weapons. We need to come in and inspect your factories. You're a very rogue nation. You're a rogue nation. You don't follow international law, so you're an outlaw rogue nation. You're a volatile state. We're not going to allow you to have weapons. It's not in the global interest to allow Iraq to have nuclear weapons. And the UN would come in with weapons inspectors, and sometimes they'd find evidence that Iraq has been trying to make nuclear weapons. And then Iraq would kick the UN weapons inspectors out. This game is continued through most of President Clinton's 2 terms in office. So Clinton keeps coming in saying, oh, okay, we need to look at your factories. And often Saddam Hussein would say, you're not allowed to look at our factories. And then he'd say, if you don't let us look at your factories, we're going to have to bomb you. And then Saddam Hussein would say, come look at our factories. And sometimes when they look at the factories, they'd find suspicious stuff saying, you guys are making weapons of mass destruction. So at times, when in the 1990s Saddam Hussein would say, you're not allowed to use our or you're not allowed to look at them, then the UN would say, well, nobody's going to buy your oil anymore. We're going to have an embargo against your oil. So under Bill Clinton, there was a oil embargo against Iraq that killed more than 1 million Iraqi people because it created a famine in Iraq. If the Iraqis are not selling oil, their economy is very limited. So you could say that there's more casualties under the Democrats than the Republicans. But make a long story short, by the time that 9/11 happens, now President George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, has an opportunity to finish his dad's war. Now he's going to go back to the Gulf. He's going to commit the regime change, get rid of that guy that's been a thorn in their side for a decade, and put in a US-friendly government. And even though there's no direct tie between the Iraqi government and Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, in fact, they hate each other. Bin Laden and Hussein are rivals for power within the Middle East. The narrative is sold that the Iraqis are still developing weapons of mass destruction, and their Iraqi weapon of mass destruction could fall into Al-Qaeda hands and be used against the US. So the United States had already started a war in Afghanistan after 9/11 to try to find Al-Qaeda. So they've been at war in Afghanistan since September of 2001. Now the war is extended in 2003 into Iraq. And as it's extended into Iraq, they do a regime change and a pro-American Iraqi government is created. And the United States will help that Iraqi government create a police force and a military that will uphold American law and try to create a constitution of individualism. In 2005, there's an election in Iraq. And in the 2005 election in Iraq, pro and anti-US parties are allowed to run, which should be a testimony to the success of the US imposing of liberalism. But one of the problems that we see with the 2005 Iraqi parliamentary election is that Iraq is very regionalized. That in the north, you have people voting not for ideology, but basically for nationalism. They want to see a Kurdistan in the north. And then the southern part of Iraq is divided into east and west based upon more religious lines, more cultural lines. So as a result of the imposing of liberalism on Iraq, we see the balkanizing and fragmenting of Iraq as people's loyalties are no longer subject to the absolute power of Saddam Hussein. They realize that some people don't even want to be in Iraq. Some people identify more as being Sunni or being Kurdish or being a Shiite. So the Iraqi National Assembly, instead of having a liberal party and a conservative party and an NDP, they have parties that identify with religion or culture, showing that Iraq, the country of Iraq, maybe like the country of Yugoslavia, it really shouldn't exist. There is no one Iraq. There should be maybe 3 different Iraqs, one Kurdish, one Shiite, one Sunni, and that fragmenting of Iraq will help create ISIS and ISIL, as within the fragmenting of Iraq following the 2003 intervention, there's an opportunity for new local strongmen to try to create their own fiefdom. And that's what ISIS and ISIL were basically local strongmen saying, well, now that Saddam Hussein doesn't have authority here, who's going to take control in the northwestern part of Iraq? Well, that became ISIS and ISIL, and then they became a threat within Turkey and Syria, and to some extent, even within Lebanon and Jordan. So, I mean, I could talk about Iraq all day, but that's to make a long story fairly long, but condensed. Any other questions? So we might see some content about Afghanistan. So what kinds of questions should you be asking in Afghanistan? Why did Canada go to war in Afghanistan but not Iraq? Might be a question you'd ask. Now, why did we send troops to Afghanistan and not Iraq? We sent troops to Afghanistan as a part of our commitment to NATO. So NATO has a charter, and within that charter, it says an attack on one is an attack on all. That's collective security. And we'll learn that a little bit more tomorrow. But America was attacked by forces that were in and trained in Afghanistan. So we go to war in Afghanistan as a response to 9/11 as a part of our conditions with NATO. But we decide to not go to war in Iraq because the Liberal government couldn't find enough evidence that Iraq posed a threat to NATO. So Canada's in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. Unofficially, Canada is still in Afghanistan today. We still have troops involved, but in a less official sense. But Canada's role in Afghanistan is to impose liberalism. You know, this is a case study of trying to build a nation. And there's a great website for you with Afghanistan. You know, what did Canada's military role do in Afghanistan? Well, Canada's military role within Afghanistan was to change hearts and minds. And we're quite open about that we were about changing hearts and minds. We're trying to change hearts and minds so that, you know, violence and militarism wasn't the only expression. That we're trying to change hearts and minds so that people could understand that multiplicity and plurality could coexist. We're trying to give girls a chance to go to school. We're trying to give capitalism a chance to flourish. Try to get rid of a lot of the corruption that existed in Afghanistan due to the presence of, you know, drug lords and tribal warlords. So Canada unapologetically was trying to rebuild the nation of Afghanistan, which meant that in Afghanistan, Canadian troops were building runways and repairing bridges and building schools and building hospitals. That's our legacy in Afghanistan. You know, legacy, what did you leave behind? We left behind infrastructure that we hope the Afghan people could use to become a more successful state. Instead of being a failed state that was very feudal, very conservative, we wanted a more successful state that could be a part of the global village. And in order to do that, they needed things like bridges and runways that had been destroyed by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The Taliban had destroyed many of these things to try to imprison the people of Afghanistan. And Canada was there to try to free the people of Afghanistan from the Taliban. Please keep in mind that the Taliban were not Afghani to begin with. The Taliban were a group of Pakistani students that invaded Afghanistan. So you could argue that we were liberating Afghanistan from a foreign oppressor. But as we know, the Taliban is still very popular in Afghanistan. That when the Canadians pull out, the Canadians will leave parts of Afghanistan still under the influence of the Taliban. So just recently, the United States and the Taliban signed a deal to end that war. And there's a link to that. And that's acknowledging the fact that the United States understands that the Taliban has a right to exist. That the Taliban is the voice of some American people, or sorry, probably still some American people too, but some Afghani people that's their will, that they will that government to exist. So it is interesting to note that ultimately the success in Afghanistan was limited. The success in Iraq was limited because it created in Iraq, it created a civil war. And in Afghanistan, there's still elements of the Taliban that are quite powerful, especially in some of the mountainous regions in the north. Any other questions about the contemporary world? any of these case studies that are just completely foreign to you? If not, my suggestion would be to go through lesson 28 and go to the pink links. If you've already done that, then your next step might be to go through lesson 30, preview that for tomorrow, because we're going to go through the Cold War quite quickly tomorrow. But also be working on the analysis of your source for your essay that we went through. So finish up your intro to that essay now. Figure out your argumentation that you'd like to take. Maybe plan out your body. And to some extent, take a look back and see, what is it about economics and politics did you struggle on? I did a YouTube video this morning for the first 20 multiple choice questions that you guys did on the exam on Friday. I'll do the second set of 20 probably tomorrow morning, and then I'll release those as well. So if you want a chance to look at, what were the right answers on Friday, if you didn't get 100%, then I will give you those links so that you can look at that. But I have the second half still to film. So Wednesday we have our final exams. We have an A1. We have a set of 55 multiple choice questions. On Thursday, we have also on Wednesday, sorry, we have the essay due by midnight. On Thursday, we have the term project due. And after that, on Friday, we don't, and Thursday, we don't really have hangouts in the sense of here's new information for me to push out. What I'd like to see you do on Thursday and Friday is be asking me specific questions as you review the course. So the purpose of Thursday and Friday is for you to review the content, because we're going to get together at WCHS on Tuesday the 4th. So after the long weekend, we're gonna come to WCHS, and we'll probably gather at 10 a.m. And I want to be able to focus on the diploma the next day, but focused more on the writing assignments than on content. So content questions should be asked me by email on the 30th and 31st, so that on the 4th, we can focus on not content like what's the new deal, more like this is what the essays could look like and this is how we use the new deal. So the reason why I don't have any hangout specifically on the 30th or 31st is on the 30th in the morning, you have to finish up your term project. And then the rest of the 30th and all of the 31st, you need to be reviewing now. So you need to go back, go over all your lessons, go over your cast of characters, go over your notes, and see which case studies don't you understand, so that we can gather on the 4th and it can be meaningful for you. Then the diploma exams the 5th at 9 a.m. at WCHS. And then we will have the week after, on the 10th, we'll have another review session. And then on the 11th, we'll have the second half of the diploma. So good news, the end is very, very, very near. We have, and then I'll get to Haley's question. The end is very, very, very near. We have lots of things left, but soon it'll go from like, oh man, my days are so busy, to, oh, now I got lots of free time. And many of you are beginning to spike. Your marks are starting to go up. So keep working, and I'm sure that'll pay off for you. So Haley asked, what are the time options for the final on Wednesday? The same as usual? And since we only have one essay, will the time frame be shorter? The time frame won't be shorter. It will be the same as usual. So basically, I'll open it up an AM and a PM version. And it's not shorter because basically you're going to have a 6-hour window to do both, part A and part B. So whether you go from 8 to 2 or 2 to 8, you're doing both the multiple choice and the writing. So it'll be a 6-hour window to do 55 multiple choice questions and an A1 activity. And yes, we'll have some probably start at 8 a.m. and we'll probably have some start at 2, and that's it. I would highly recommend doing the morning because you're going to want in the afternoon, you're going to need to finish your essay and get your term project done, unless you already have those kinds of things done. So I know a lot of people prefer the afternoon, but definitely this Wednesday, next week, and the week after that, there's times where we really have to focus on social studies and not be, say, working in the morning of Wednesday or working. We can't be working the day of these diploma exams. We can't really be working the day before diploma exams. We need to be ready for the diplomas. So over the next few weeks, there's certain days like this Wednesday, and then the 4th and the 5th and the 10th and the 11th, when you really need to, not saying that this is a problem for you, Haley, but just in general, we really need to be focused on summer school so we can finish strong. And I think a lot of people are going to finish strong. So what are the time options? The same, AM, PM, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. And yes, it's 55 multiple choice and one set of A1. Any other questions? Tomorrow we're looking at the Cold War. Chapter 7 of the textbook does an excellent job with it. We're not going to go through the entire timeline of the Cold War. We're going to hit some major points. We're going to talk about some major concepts. Definitely McCarthyism comes up a lot. Imposing liberalism comes up a lot. So some of the topics we talked about today come up again. Containment comes up a lot. But we also need to go back and make sure you understand détente and the arms race and things like that. Any other questions? How many questions are on the economic unit in the multiple choice test? How many questions from the economic? So of the 55 questions on the final exam, how many might be from the economic unit? So I don't know the exact number. I do know that there's more on this unit from this week than there would be on a diploma because we don't have a unit test for this week. Of the 55, I'm going to say there might be somewhere around 15. 15 economic, 15 political, and maybe 20 that are more of this contemporary world. But there are some questions that are more just basically based on the whole course. So it's based on liberalism, like big picture liberalism, this concept. So there's some questions that kind of are holistic and really are based upon, now that you know the whole story, how does it fit together? The nice thing about the final exam on Wednesday is when you're done the multiple choice, you should be leaving it saying, oh, this is the unit I need to study most. Or you should be able to leave it and say, oh, I feel fairly confident in this area for sure. Maybe I don't need to, I don't need to go back and look at Adam Smith. I really get Adam Smith. So one of the reasons to have the final exam is so that you can target your studying on Thursday and Friday. You can be very specific and say, where was I confused? Another way to prep for the multiple choice on Part B of the diploma is to go through my YouTube videos where I go through all the released items and see if you're confused about any of the questions there. All right, so it appears that nobody has any other questions. If your questions have been answered, you might want to just jump away and go work on all those other things. If you do have any questions, feel free to stick around and ask away.